On a December night in 1966, inside the small back garage of the best damn garage in town in Daytona, the yellow shop lights cast long shadows across thin wisps of smoke rising from a metal block still radiating heat. Smokey Unick, the man famous for bending every rule without quite breaking it, stood silently before Pontiac's inline-six engine. He lit a cigarette, drew in a slow breath, and murmured a line only the few young mechanics beside him could hear. "If I can make this I-6 run like a V8, Detroit's gonna lose its mind." The engine fired a moment later, raspy, sharp, and defiant, like a secret straining to escape its chains. By the mid-1960s, America was deep in a horsepower boom. Every weekend, the thunder of Chevrolet, Ford, and Mopar V8s shook NASCAR tracks, while Main Street dealerships competed with ever bolder horsepower claims, selling speed as if it were the American dream itself. Pontiac, long respected for bruising V8s, like the 389 and 421, suddenly made a wildly un-Detroit decision to develop a modern overhead cam inline-six, lighter, cleaner, and capable of revving higher than anything Detroit had built before. The idea sounded logical on paper, but the US market at the time was practically obsessed with V8s. A performance car with only 6 cylinders. Customers would laugh, dealers would protest, journalists would question whether Pontiac had lost its mind. And inside General Motors, a deeper anxiety simmered. Changing NASCAR rules, pressure from federal antitrust regulators forcing GM to downplay high performance, and constant internal turf wars that left bold innovations vulnerable to timid executives. In that environment, the Pontiac OHC Sprint 6 was born as a quiet experiment, a machine blending European sporting spirit with American punch, built on a familiar inline-six foundation, but reborn with a single overhead cam and a belt-driven distributor reminiscent of race car engineering. Pontiac hoped it would become a strategic weapon for the Firebird and Tempest, appealing to younger drivers who wanted speed, but also something lighter, better balanced, and simply different from the usual V8 roar. And then Smokey Unick stepped into the picture, the man who forced NASCAR to rewrite rules just to keep up with him. The man whose touch could turn any piston engine into something faster, angrier, and controversial. When Pontiac shipped Smokey a Sprint 6 for evaluation, they had no idea that decision would thrust their humble 6-cylinder into the center of a storm, a tale of conflict, creativity, and mechanical genius. To understand the Pontiac OHC Sprint 6, you have to meet it the way Smokey Unick did, not as a mere engine, but as a stubborn underdog with a chip on its shoulder. The moment Smokey pulled the aluminum cam cover off, he didn't see a 6-cylinder compromise, the way Detroit marketers did. He saw potential, raw, unpolished, aching to be pushed, where corporate engineers weren't allowed to go. The Sprint 6 was already an oddball in Detroit's landscape, a 230 cubic inch inline-6 rebuilt with a single overhead cam, a fiberglass cam gear, a belt drive where everyone else used noisy chains, and a Rochester quadrajet carb perched on an intake that looked too serious for a 6. It wasn't born to be the fastest engine on Woodward Avenue. It was born to be different, lighter on its feet, smoother at high RPM, and shaped for a generation that craved something more than big cubic inches. Inside Pontiac engineering, the engine was the baby of John DeLorean's breakaway culture, a team of young, restless engineers who believed Detroit had grown too safe, too heavy, too predictable. Bill Collins, one of the sharpest minds in the room, championed the OHC idea with the stubborn optimism of a man who hated compromise. Herb Adams, the engineer who would later father Pontiac's Trans Am program, pushed for the sprint version to rev higher, breathe better, and carry the soul of a European touring car. But once the design reached Smokey's garage, the engine took on a different destiny. Smokey Yunick didn't care about trends, committees, or GM politics. He cared about winning. And when Smokey looked at the Sprint 6, he didn't see a marketing experiment. He saw a challenge. The big V8s dominated NASCAR, ruled the ovals, bullied the garages. If Smokey could make a six-cylinder run like one of them, maybe outsmart one of them, then suddenly, the whole balance of Detroit's horsepower war would tilt, even if only for a moment. His relationship with Pontiac was both affectionate and explosive. DeLorean admired Smokey's boldness, but corporate managers feared it. They wanted clean data, tidy reports, safe improvements. Smokey wanted none of that. He wanted to tear into the Sprint 6 like it was a junkyard dog he was training for a street fight. And so the cast of characters formed around the engine. Pontiac's young engineers dreaming of innovation, GM executives nervously guarding their rulebooks, and Smokey Yunick, the wild card who ignored every boundary until someone caught him, then found a loophole anyway. In Smokey's hands, the Sprint 6 became more than a project. It became a personality, a lean, hungry outsider with something to prove in a world ruled by cubic-inch kings. And as Smokey's wrenches clattered across the workbench, the line between man and machine blurred. Each modification reflected not just engineering intuition, but the relentless, rebellious spirit of the man himself. Smokey Yunick always said an engine talks if you know how to listen. And when he tore deeper into the Pontiac OHC Sprint 6, he heard something most engineers had missed: a mechanical rhythm that wanted to spin faster, breathe deeper, and fight harder than its conservative factory tuning ever allowed. To Smokey, the Sprint 6 wasn't underbuilt, it was undertrusted. The basic architecture was already unusual for Detroit. A tall, rigid inline block cast from Pontiac's old 194 cubic inch design, topped with an aluminum head that looked like it belonged on a European rally car. The single overhead cam rode in a cast housing driven by a fiberglass reinforced belt, an elegant idea in theory, though one Smokey considered one step away from a lawnmower setup. But what fascinated him wasn't the belt, it was the valve train geometry: long intake runners, Siamese ports, and a cam profile that hinted at high RPM ambition, even if corporate lawyers made sure it never fully expressed itself. Smokey's first modification was simple: airflow. He ported the head until the casting practically glowed. Factory engineers treated the intake passages like narrow hallways. Smokey turned them into racetrack straightaways. He reshaped valve throats, blended bowls, and opened the chambers to unshroud the valves, work that no GM test cell would ever approve. Then he tossed the stock camshaft onto a shelf and ground his own: more duration, more lift, tighter lobe separation. The factory redline was 6,500 RPM. Smokey aimed past 7,500. The Rochester Quadrajet, a clever but temperamental piece, became his next battlefield. Smokey reworked the booster ventures, enlarged the secondary air door stops, and let the carburetor gulp air like a man surfacing from deep water. When Pontiac asked for documentation, Smokey sent back a handwritten note: "She breathes now." But the biggest drama wasn't the modifications, it was the internal politics swirling around them. Pontiac loved what Smokey was achieving, but GM corporate was terrified. A six-cylinder, that performed like a small V8, that threatened price structures, marketing plans, and sacred hierarchies. Worse yet, if Smokey pushed the engine too hard and it failed, executives would blame the concept, not the constraints. Smokey was aware of the tension, but he shrugged it off. He reinforced the crank webbing, balanced the rotating assembly with surgical precision, and experimented with forged pistons and re-angled spark plugs. His dyno pulls shook the garage. When the engine screamed, Smokey grinned, because that scream wasn't just mechanical. It was the Sprint 6 finally telling the truth about itself. Through all this, Smokey worked alone, or with one trusted helper, late into the Florida nights. Corporate deadlines meant nothing. Inspiration came when it wanted. The engine wasn't just a project. It was an act of rebellion. And every time Smokey tightened a bolt, he felt he was tightening his grip on an idea Detroit didn't yet have the courage to embrace. In the end, it wasn't horsepower that killed Smokey Unique's Sprint 6. It wasn't reliability or engineering limits, or even Smokey's habit of pushing every mechanical boundary he touched. What doomed the project was fear, the quiet, suffocating kind that lives in boardrooms, not garages. By early 1967, Smokey's prototype Sprint 6 was producing numbers that made Pontiac engineers stare in disbelief. The torque curve was no longer a gentle slope. It lunged upward like a V8. The engine pulled hard past 7,000 RPM, sounding less like a six-cylinder and more like a war cry. Smokey believed he could squeeze even more with revised headers and a hotter cam. But before he could test those ideas, Pontiac sent word from Detroit: stop. GM executives had grown uneasy. A six-cylinder that rivaled small V8 performance threatened to upset carefully planned sales hierarchies. Dealers couldn't sell a premium 8 if a cheaper 6 could run beside it. Insurance companies were already clamping down on muscle cars, and corporate lawyers were still battling the antitrust spotlight that forced GM to downplay performance entirely. The Sprint 6, especially Smokey's Sprint 6, was becoming politically radioactive. Smokey didn't take the news well. He'd spent months shaping the engine into something lean, aggressive, and truly unique. He argued, pleaded, cursed, and finally resigned himself to the reality that happens in every corporate-soaked story. The bold idea was being strangled because it was too good. Pontiac retrieved the engine, ran a few sanitized tests, and quietly shelved the project. The official line was simple: market conditions, but the unofficial whispers, those traveled further. Some claimed that Smokey's Sprint 6 made more power than Pontiac's 326 V8, and that GM brass panicked. Others said Smokey was gearing up for a racing program with the 6 that would have blindsided Ford and Chrysler. A few swore the engine didn't come back from Pontiac's test lab in the same conditions Smokey sent it, that someone deliberately detuned it to erase the evidence. Smokey himself stirred the legend. In later years, whenever the Sprint 6 came up, he'd smile that sly cowboy grin and say, "They were scared of it. That's all you need to know." Most of the parts he crafted disappeared. Smokey rarely kept drawings. He preferred instinct to documentation. The custom camshaft, the reworked head, the carburetor mods, many believe they were locked away in Pontiac's engineering archive, later lost in the corporate purges of the 1970s. A few insist a single experimental head survived and passed quietly through private collectors, surfacing only in rumors at swap meets and back-channel Pontiac clubs. And that leaves us with the question Smokey never stopped asking. What if Detroit had embraced the OHC Sprint 6 instead of fearing it? What if Pontiac had built a high-revving six-cylinder Trans Am car? What if the muscle era had made room for engines built on finesse instead of brute cubic inches? The answers are gone now, scattered like Smokey's ash across the concrete floor of that little Daytona garage. But the myth remains, a reminder that sometimes the greatest machines aren't the ones Detroit built, but the ones it was too afraid to try.